5 Apache widows knocked on his door. The rain came the way trouble always came to the high desert, without warning and without apology. Calloway heard it first as a hiss in the dry creosote, then felt it on her face, cold and needle-sharp, as she pressed herself against the canyon wall and listened to the hoofbeats fade behind her. 3 days she had been running. Her boots had split at the left heel on the second day, and her feet had learned the specific language of pain that comes from wet leather and stone. She did not think about the pain. She thought about distance. Distance was the only currency she had left. She smelled the wood smoke before she saw the cabin, that particular smell, cedar and pine pitch, that her grandmother's house had carried in winter, a smell that meant warmth existed somewhere in the world and that she had not always been cold. Her body moved toward it before her mind gave permission. There were already women at the door. She stopped at the edge of the ponderosa pines and counted them in the gray falling light. 5 figures, wrapped in blankets and oilcloth, standing in a half-circle before a low cabin door as if they had formed a small council and were waiting for someone to call it to order. Apache women, she could see that much from their dress, from the way they held themselves, which was the way of people who do not apologize for where they stand. The smallest of them carried a child on her back, sleeping against the rain. The tallest held a wrapped bundle against her chest, as if it were something she had promised someone she would not drop. Did not move. She had learned that stillness was sometimes safer than retreat. The cabin door opened. The man who filled it was not what she expected, which was nothing, because she had learned not to expect things from men. He was broad across the shoulders and dressed in the plain clothes of a working rancher, canvas trousers, a flannel shirt gone soft with washing, and he stood in the door with the lamplight behind him and looked at the 5 women with an expression that she could not read from the tree line, but that was not, she was certain, the expression of a man who intended harm. He spoke. She could not hear the words over the rain, but she saw the women respond. The tallest one lifted her chin, and the man stepped back, and he opened the door wider and they went in. Calloway stood in the pines and understood that she had nowhere else to go. She crossed the yard in 12 steps and knocked before she could think better of it. When the door opened again, the man looked down at her. She was not a tall woman, and she braced herself for what she had learned to brace herself for. The inventory of her face, the calculation behind the eyes, the decision being made about what she was worth or what she owed. But he only looked at her the way you look at something that has come through weather, which is to say with the concern of someone who understands what weather costs. "There's room," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Come in out of the rain." She went in. The cabin smelled of coffee and wet wool and that cedar smoke that had pulled her across the dark yard, and the 5 women were arranged near the fire, some seated, some standing, and they looked at her without suspicion, which surprised her, because she had grown accustomed to suspicion. The child on the small woman's back had woken and was watching me with the solemn attention of the very young. A bowl of something hot was pressed into me's hands by the tall woman before me had taken off her coat, and the warmth of it moved from her palms up through her wrists and into the frozen place behind her sternum, and she stood there in the middle of all these strangers and felt, against her considerable experience to the contrary, that she was not in immediate danger. The man moved to the fire and crouched before it and added a piece of split pine, and the fire responded with a clean, bright surge of heat. He did not look at her again. He gave her the dignity of not being watched. "Sit," said the tall woman, in English that carried the particular precision of someone who had learned the language as a choice rather than a necessity. She gestured to a low stool near the fire. "You are wet." Me sat. The bowl in her hands was beans and something that had been venison, and the warmth of it was almost unbearable after 3 days of cold. She did not cry. She ate. His name, she learned that night, was Colt Hardin, and he had run cattle in this valley for 11 years. The women she would learn in pieces over the days that followed. Dea, who was the tall one who had lost her husband to a cavalry raid 6 months past, Lena and her sister Mika, who had lost theirs in the same raid. Old Siki, who had lost her husband to fever and her son to the same raid, and who said almost nothing but whose hands were always moving, braiding, mending, shaping. And young Fawn, who carried the child, whose husband had been the last one the cavalry took and who had not spoken his name aloud since. 5 women, 5 griefs with different faces. Me had her own grief, which was the grief of the living. Her husband was not dead, but she had fled him as if he were something worse than death, which he was. Colt Hardin had given them all a place by his fire. Me did not know what to make of a man like that. She had not known there were men like that. She lay that night on a pallet near the far wall and listened to the rain on the roof and the breathing of the women around her and the particular silence of a man who sleeps alone in the next room and does not impose his sleeping on anyone. The smell of the cedar smoke settled over her like something placed there deliberately. The fire had burned low, but its warmth remained in the walls, in the packed earth floor, in the wool of the blanket someone had put over her while she slept. She did not know who had put it there. She did not ask. Her left foot ached where the boot had split. She pressed it against the floor and felt the specific pain of it and thought, "You are still here. This is still the world. You ran far enough." She slept. In the morning the rain had stopped, and the world smelled of wet sage and red earth, and the cold specific clarity that comes after desert rain, as if the air itself had been wrung out and hung to dry. Me woke before the others and lay still for a moment, listening. Habit, not peace. The habit of a woman who has learned that mornings can change without warning. But the cabin held its quiet. The fire had been rekindled. Someone had been up before her. She found Colt Hardin outside at the woodpile, splitting pine in the early gray light with the methodical ease of a man who has done this 10,000 times and finds nothing remarkable in it. He did not hear her or pretended not to. And she stood in the doorway a moment watching him, the rise and fall of the axe, the clean split of the wood, the way he stacked the pieces without looking at what his hands were doing. She had grown up watching her father work, and had learned early that you could read a man's character in how he worked when no one was watching. Colt Hardin worked the same as he would have worked with an audience, which is to say without performance. He looked up. "Coffee," he said, not an offer exactly, a report. The coffee existed and she was welcome to it. "Thank you," she said. Inside, she found the pot on the iron stove, dark coffee, the kind that had been boiling long enough to mean business, and she poured 2 cups without deciding to and carried one back outside and set it on the fence post near where he worked. He nodded without pausing. This was how it began between them, this specific and unspoken language of small courtesies that do not ask for anything in return. The women rose at different times. Fawn's child, a boy of about 2, named for something in Apache that me could not yet say, was the first voice of the morning, not crying but talking, the serious, purposeful talk of a child who has things to communicate and trusts that the world wants to hear them. Old Siki was next, moving to the fire with the unhurried authority of someone who has decided that the fire is her domain and intends to keep it. She began to cook without consulting anyone, producing from the stores in the corner a cornmeal porridge that smelled of something sweetened, and the smell of it brought me's body back from wherever it had been in the night. Her hands remembered her mother's kitchen the way the mind never quite could, the specific smell of cornmeal toasting in an iron pan, which was not this exact smell, but was close enough that her hands went still around her coffee cup, and she was briefly not in a cabin in the high desert, but in a farmhouse in Missouri with the morning coming through a window that had curtains, yellow curtains, the particular yellow of old cotton washed many times. Then Fawn's boy said something loudly and definitively from across the room, and she was back. Around mid-morning, a rider came. He came from the south, moving fast. Me heard the hoofbeats before she saw him, and her body went tight the way it had learned to go tight, the muscles across her shoulders drawing up without her permission. But Colt had already moved to the door, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he recognized the rider, and that recognition was not the recognition of threat. The rider was a young man, a rancher's hand by his dress, who pulled up in the yard and leaned down from his saddle with the particular urgency of someone carrying news they cannot keep. "Hardin," he said, "army's moving through the valley again. Colonel Marsh's men. They're taking Apache off the land, anyone they find not on the reservation." He looked at the cabin at the doorway where me stood. "Anyone here of Apache in the area ought to know." Colt said nothing for a moment. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his face quiet. "I'll bear that in mind," he said. The rider nodded and turned his horse and was gone in a rising of red dust. Me looked at Colt. He was already turning back toward the cabin, and his face had changed, not with fear exactly, but with the specific gravity of a man who has just been given a problem that requires solving. "They cannot stay in the open," he said, low enough that only she heard. "No," she agreed. He looked at her then, a real look, the first one he had given her that lasted long enough to mean something. She did not flinch from it. She had learned to read looks, and this one was not calculation. It was the look of a man deciding whether he can trust someone with a difficult thing. "There's a box canyon 2 miles north," he said. "Hidden enough. I've kept cattle there in hard winters." A pause. "I'd need help moving them." "Tell me what to do," said me. She did not know why she said it. She had spent 3 years learning not to volunteer for anything, learning that volunteering was how you got used. But the women were inside with their griefs and their sleeping child, and this man had opened his door without asking what they owed him, and me Calloway's hands remembered how to work even when the rest of her had forgotten why. They told the women. Dea listened with the still attention of someone who has already survived the worst outcome and is now simply navigating what comes after. She translated for Siki and for Fawn, who understood some English but received difficult news better in her own language. There was a brief conversation among the women that me could not follow, quick and low, with Siki speaking the most and Dea listening with her eyes closed, and then Dea looked at Colt. "We know how to move without being seen," she said. "This is not new to us." Colt nodded. "Tonight then, before dawn." The day moved differently after that, with the particular focus that comes when everyone in a room knows that something must be done and has decided to do it together. Siki cooked. Mika and Lena gathered what could be carried. Fawn wrapped her boy against her back with the practiced efficiency of someone who has made that motion 1,000 times. Dea stood at the window and watched the road. Me packed what little she had, which was almost nothing, and then helped Colt load the 2 mules with supplies and blankets, and the cast iron pot that Siki refused to leave behind. The cast iron pot was heavy. Me carried it without complaint. At one point, lifting a bundle of bedrolls, her hands went suddenly cold with the memory of another kind of packing frantic, 3 nights ago, stuffing what she could into a saddlebag while she could hear her husband's boots on the stairs. The cold of that memory moved through her palms and up her wrists, and she stood still a moment, eyes closed, breathing. "Here," said Colt's voice, and she felt the weight of the bundle taken from her hands. She opened her eyes. He had taken it, not because she couldn't carry it, but because her hands had gone still and he had noticed. He said nothing else. He simply carried it to the mule and lashed it on and turned back for the next load. Me stood there a moment in the afternoon light and understood that she was not being rescued. She was being treated as someone whose hands had gone cold for a moment, and who would be ready to work again in a moment, and who did not need to explain herself. She did not. The canyon smelled of cold stone and old juniper, and the particular dry mineral smell of rock that has been in shadow so long it has forgotten the sun. They arrived before dawn, moving by starlight and the knowledge of the land that Colt carried in his body, not as memory exactly but as something deeper. The way a man knows how to walk without thinking about walking. The mules moved quietly. Fawn's boy slept. The canyon opened suddenly from a narrow cleft in the rock face, widening into a space that held a natural spring, a stand of cottonwood, and enough flat ground for a camp. Colt had built a rough shelter against the canyon wall in some previous winter, 3 walls and a roof of pine poles, open at the front to the fire that would be built just inside the entrance. They made the camp in the dark, working by feel and by the faint suggestion of starlight that reached the canyon floor. Me found that she worked well in the dark. Her hands knew what her hands knew, the tying of knots and the arrangement of bedding and the coaxing of green wood to catch from dry. She and Colt worked near each other in the pre-dawn cold, and the nearness of him was something she was aware of in the way you are aware of a fire when you have been cold. Not consciously, not with intention, but in the body's continuous and honest accounting of what is near and what is warm. They were building a fire break, a ring of flat stones around the fire pit, when their hands met on the same stone. It was a moment, and no more than a moment. His hand was large and rough-palmed and warm, and hers was cold from the stone, and the contact lasted only the beat it took for each of them to register the other and withdraw. But something shifted in her chest, the way the air shifts before weather, a small interior movement, like a door swinging slightly on its hinges without opening fully. She moved to the next stone. He moved to the next stone. Neither of them spoke about it, because there was nothing to speak about. A touch in the dark over a fire break, and yet her hands knew it the way her hands knew everything, longer than her mind, more honestly. When the camp was established and the fire burning and the women settled, Colt sat across the fire from me and drank coffee from a tin cup and said, after a long silence, "Where were you running from?" Me looked at the fire. The question was simple, and its simplicity was almost more than she could answer, because the truth was simple too. She had run from a man who believed that a wife was a possession, and that possessions did not get to have their own ideas about things. "A bad situation," she said. He nodded. He did not push. He held his cup in both hands and watched the fire with the patience of a man who has learned that some stories come in their own time, and that pressing them is like pressing a bruise. You only get pain, not progress. "Same for them," he said, meaning the women. "Different shape." Me looked at Dea, who was sitting with her back against the canyon wall, her eyes open and watching the entrance of the canyon with a watchfulness that was not fear but vigilance. The watchfulness of someone who has learned that danger comes through openings, and so you watch openings. Lena and Mika were asleep, pressed together for warmth. Siki had her hands moving even in the firelight, braiding something from strips of leather, her lips moving slightly as if she were talking to the braid. Fawn was awake too, the boy asleep on her lap, and she was looking at the stars that were visible in the strip of sky above the canyon walls with an expression that me could not name, but that she recognized, the expression of someone looking at something vast and trying to find room inside themselves for how vast it is. "You do this often?" me asked, "taking strays?" The word was out before she could weigh it. She had meant it as something wry, something self-deprecating, but it sat between them in the firelight and felt suddenly inadequate to describe what these women were, what she was. Colt looked at her across the fire. "No," he said, "first time." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere above the canyon rim, a nighthawk called once and was silent. "Because it was the right thing," he said, "and I had room." Me considered this. She had known men who did the right thing the way they did a transaction, with the expectation of return, with the ledger always open. This man's voice carried none of that. He said it the way he split wood without performance because it was simply what was true. She thought about what it meant to have room, not just space in a cabin, room in the self, that particular spaciousness of someone who is not so full of their own wants that there is no place for anyone else's need. She had not known many people like that. She was not sure she was one herself, though she thought she might be trying to become one slowly, the way the canyon was shaped slowly by water, not quickly enough to see, but definitely enough to matter. They sat with the fire between them until the cold deepened and the others slept, and me felt the warmth of the fire on her face and the cold at her back, and the particular aliveness of a body that has been through difficulty and arrived, against the odds, at another morning. "I'll take first watch," she said. He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "Tell me what I'm watching for." He told her. He pointed out the shapes of the canyon rim against the stars, the places where a rider could descend without being heard, the sounds the horses made when they were nervous. He showed her where the rifle was. He showed her without condescension, which is to say he showed her as you show a capable person a thing they have not yet been shown, not slowly, not with excessive explanation, but with the assumption that she would understand. She understood. He slept, she watched. The stars moved in their ancient slow rotation above the strip of sky, and the fire settled to coals, and Fawn's boy made a small sound in his sleep that was not distress but something between contentment and dreaming. The horses were quiet. The canyon held them all in its cold stone arms, and the night moved through without incident, which is its own kind of mercy. Around the hour before dawn, Dea came and sat beside me without being asked, and they kept watch together in companionable silence. Two women with different griefs and the same watchfulness, and me understood that this too was something. This easy assumption that me was trustworthy enough to share a watch with, this quiet beside her that expected nothing. The dawn came the way it comes in high desert, not gradually but all at once, the sky moving from black to deep blue to a sudden impossible gold at the canyon rim, the light coming down the walls in a slow, visible tide. Me watched it happen and felt something ease in the tightly held machinery of her chest. Not peace, not yet, but the suggestion of peace, a small unlocking, one notch, like a door that has been shut too long and is beginning slowly, with great effort, to move. The army came on the third day. Me heard them first, the creak and jingle of cavalry equipment, the sound carrying clean and hard through the dry air. She was at the canyon entrance gathering wood when she heard it, and she did not move, only lifted her head the way an animal lifts its head, all of her listening. The sound was south of them, a quarter-mile at least, moving along the main trail, moving parallel to the canyon, not toward it, but close. She set down the wood and went back fast into the canyon. Not running, running made noise, and she found Colt at the spring watering the horses. "Cavalry," she said, "south of us, close." He was still for one beat. Then he moved efficiently, without wasted motion, catching the horses and leading them deeper into the cottonwood stand where the canyon's shadow was deepest. "Tell them no fire," he said over his shoulder. "Tell Siki no smoke." Me went a Siki first, because Siki had a small cook fire going and Siki was the one who would need convincing. She crouched beside her and spoke low. "Soldiers, we need to put it out." Siki looked at her with eyes that had seen many soldiers and the things soldiers did, and she took the water skin from beside her and poured it on the fire without comment. The smoke rose briefly and then was gone. Dea had already woken Lena and Mika. Fawn had the boy pressed against her chest, her hand cupped over his mouth, not restraining him but communicating. He was two and he was perceptive, and he read his mother's body the way children read everything completely, and he was still. They waited. The cavalry sounds moved south and west, and for a long time no one breathed fully, and the canyon held its silence like something cupped in a hand. Me crouched near the canyon wall with her back against the stone and her hands braced on the ground, and listened with everything she had. The sounds did not grow louder, they did not turn. They faded. Slowly, by degrees, the tension in the canyon released, not all at once but in stages, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. Mika let out a breath that she had been holding since me returned. Lena pressed her face briefly into her sister's shoulder. Old Siki looked at the wet ashes of her fire with mild reproach and began, philosophically, to rebuild it. Colt came back from the horses. He looked at me. "Good catch," he said. Something moved in her at that. Not pride exactly. She had done the only thing that made sense to do. But the acknowledgement of it was something she had not known how to receive, because acknowledgement was not something her experience had prepared her for. She nodded, because she did not have other words. "They'll come back through," said Dea. She was sitting with her knees drawn up, her voice level, stating a fact. "They always come back through." "I know," said Colt. He crouched by the fire that Siki was relighting and looked at the coals with the look of a man thinking through a problem that has no clean solution, only less bad ones. "If I go talk to Marsh himself, I know the man some, I might be able to buy time. Tell him I've got Apache workers on my land, that they're under my employ. It's done, sometimes. It won't hold forever, but it might hold long enough." "That's a risk to you," said me. "Yes. And if he doesn't agree with the story?" "Then it gets complicated," he said. Me looked at him across the small fire, at the steadiness of his face, the absence of drama in how he held himself. He was not a man who performed bravery. He was a man who identified what needed doing and then did it, quietly, the way water moves through stone, not with force but with consistency, with the patient intention of someone who intends to get through. She thought about the door he had opened, the coffee on the fence post, the fire rebuilt each morning, the blanket she had woken under, the way he had taken the bundle from her cold hands without comment. Her chest was doing the thing it had been doing, that small interior shifting, but it was larger now, less like a door on its hinges, and more like something being moved aside, something heavy she had been holding against an entrance for a very long time. She did not name it. She would not name it for some time yet. But it was there, the way weather is there before it arrives, in the quality of the air, in the direction of the wind, in the particular weight of the sky. "I'll go with you," she said. Colt looked up. "I'm a white woman," said me. "It'll look better, more like what you're saying it is." She paused. "I can handle myself." He regarded her for a moment with that steady look. Then, "I know you can." They rode out at midday, me on the smaller of the two horses, Colt on the gray gelding he called Nothing in particular. The valley opened up south of the canyon, wide and flat and full of the late autumn light that made the red rock glow from inside, and the sage was silver, and the grass was the color of old honey, and the sky was the particular blue of deep cold, brilliant and depthless. She rode beside him and did not speak for a long time, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have been through something together, and are now moving through the world on the other side of that something, and who have not yet figured out what to call what they have been through, and who find that not figuring is acceptable for now. They found Colonel Marsh at his camp near the river crossing, a lean man with a cavalry mustache and the eyes of someone who has made many decisions and regretted several. Colt talked to him plainly and without apology. These women were under his employ, working his land. Their presence was legitimate, and he would vouch for them personally. Marsh looked at me. Me looked back. She had looked back at worse men. "Your wife," said Marsh. Me opened her mouth and then closed it. She looked at Colt. The word hung between them in the cold, bright air, awkward and huge, and she was surprised to find, not entirely unwelcome. "My household," said Colt, which was careful and true. Marsh studied them both for a long moment with the measuring look of a man who suspects he is being told a partial truth but cannot quite locate the gap. Then he looked away at the river and said, "Keep them on your land. I see them off it. I can't make promises." "Understood," said Colt. They rode back in the late afternoon, the sun low and red and enormous at the canyon's edge, and Me's horse moved beneath her with the warm, rhythmic certainty of an animal that knows it is going home. The word home arrived in her mind without invitation, and she let it stay a moment before she examined it. Let it sit there like something she had found in the road that might be valuable or might be nothing, and that she would need more light to determine. She was not sure when the canyon had become a thing she was riding back toward, instead of simply a place she had been. She was not sure when Colt Hardin had become someone she thought of as something other than the man who had opened the door. But the sun was going down in a blaze of copper, and rose over the high desert, and her horse was warm beneath her. And beside her rode a man whose hands she had felt once in the dark over a ring of stones, and something in the machinery of her chest, that tight, long-held, carefully maintained machinery, had moved, one notch, one breath, 1 degree toward open. She let it. Just that much, just that 1 degree. She rode beside him in the red evening light, and she let it.